thank you all for coming to hear me and talk with me tonight. Since it's after hours on a weeknight, I'm going to try to keep this interesting and entertaining along the way. It's a story that you couldn't make it up, what I'm about to tell you. Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction. The first thing that anyone thinks when they hear me open my mouth is they try to connect this whole concept of this American accent with this guy who was the biggest foreign investor in Russia, and nobody can really understand where that came from. And everyone always wonders if they don't know my history. They wonder, how did you end up doing that? And so I'd like to tell you my own story, starting from the very beginning, because it's again, it's a pretty unique, strange story. I do have an American accent because I'm from America. I was born there. But I'm not a usual American. My grandfather, Earl Browder, who was from Kansas, got involved with the labor unions in Kansas in the 1920s. And he was so good at what he did with the labor unions in Kansas that he was recruited to come to New York to work in the unions in New York. And he was so good in New York that the communists spotted him, because New York was full of communists back in the 20s. And they said, if you like labor unionism, you're going to love communism. Why don't you come to Moscow and check it out? And so in 1927, my grandfather moved to Moscow as a young American communist, or labor unionist, I should say. And as normally happens with young men who go to Moscow, he met a Russian girl who became my grandmother. And my father, they had a child, my father. And 5 years into his stay in Russia, he was asked by the Communist Party to go back to America and become head of the Communist Party of America. So my grandfather moved back to America in 1932, became the General Secretary of the Communist Party, and ran for president twice on the communist ticket in 1936 and 1940 against Franklin Roosevelt. And he was actually the first presidential candidate to ever have a black running mate. So he was quite brave, quite individualistic. And eventually he was so brave and individualistic that at the end of the Second World War, Stalin said that you're not the kind of communist we want to have around, and kicked him out of the Communist Party. And then they went and murdered all of his followers throughout Eastern Europe. So that wasn't a very pleasant thing for him. And then he sort of drifted into oblivion politically until 1950, when the McCarthy era began. And the McCarthy era, they were going after anybody, good communists, bad communists, any type of, even people who weren't communists. And so it wasn't very helpful for my grandfather to have been the head of the Communist Party. And so he ended up getting persecuted. My father, who was a professor coming out of Princeton PhD program in mathematics, couldn't get a job in any university in America. And it was all very terrible for my family for a number of years. And then eventually the McCarthy era ended. My family was let go from this persecution. My father got a job at the University of Chicago, and everything normalized. And I was born in 1964. And I was born after all the end of this terrible trauma for my family. And I grew up in a strange American family on the south side of Chicago. And when I was a teenager, I went through my teenage rebellion, as I'm sure many of you have. But how do you rebel from a family of communists? Well, exactly. I put on a business suit. Eventually. I put on a business suit, I declared myself a businessman, and I went to Stanford Business School, because there was nothing I could do to piss off my parents more than that. So I get to Stanford Business School, and I imagine some of you here are MBAs. I've already spoken to a few of you who are. And you'll know that business school, a primary function of the curriculum is just to figure out what you're going to do after business school. And so I was searching my soul, trying to figure out, what am I good at? What's my comparative advantage? And I wasn't particularly good at anything at the time. I was pretty young. And I didn't come from a family of real estate developers or a family of Wall Street bankers. I had no real competitive advantage or calling. And I thought to myself, and I was graduating business school in 1989, which was the year that the Berlin Wall was had come down. And I said to myself, well, actually, my only competitive advantage is the fact that I come from a family of communists, and so I'm going to go to Eastern Europe and be a capitalist. And I moved to London in 1989, and I got a job with a consulting firm called the Boston Consulting Group. I worked there because they told me that they were starting an Eastern European practice, and I would be the first employee in their Eastern European practice if they ever got any work in Eastern Europe. And one day, about 6 months into it, in 1990, they said, "Bill, we've got our first assignment," and they sent me to Poland to a bus factory, which was 6 hours from Warsaw on the Ukrainian border. And the bus factory had lost all of its customers, and I think sales had declined by 90%, and they had been hired. The World Bank was going to pay for Boston Consulting Group to send a team of experts to figure out how to fix this bus factory, and they organized in the presentation that we submitted a name of a guy from the Japanese office who worked on just-in-time inventory specialties, and someone from the Cleveland office who worked with the car companies there, and someone from the LA office who specialized in marketing. And once we got the assignment, they sent me. I was 25 years old. I knew nothing about buses or anything for that matter. And I get to this little town, and it's really horrendous. The phones aren't working. They had food shortages. It was just not a very pleasant place. And I started losing weight, and I was out of touch with everybody from London. I was sitting in this town for a long time, and I was feeling pretty demoralized and not very happy. And one day, I was going to my meetings at the factory, and I had this translator who had accompanied me to everything since I didn't speak any Polish. And I noticed under the arm of my translator, he had a local newspaper. And in the local newspaper, I noticed there was these big financial statements written in Polish. And I said, why are all these financial statements in the newspaper? He said, oh, you don't know. This is very exciting. They're doing the very first privatizations in Poland. And I said, oh, that's interesting. I said, could you just translate some of this stuff for me so I could see what it says? And so I said, what does this line say? He said, this line is the profits. And I said, what is this line? He said, number of shares. And what is this line? And this is the share price that they're selling it at. And I started doing a little bit of math. I said, so let me see if I got this right. So the price of the company is 1/2 of last year's earnings. So the value of the company is 1/2 of the earnings that they had in the previous year. Now, you don't have to be a Stanford MBA to know that that's a good deal. So I figured all they had to do is stay in business for half a year, and you kind of make your money back, right? So I thought, I've never invested before in my life, but I thought, how could this not be a really great deal? And I had $4,000 of total savings in my life at this point. And so I decided to take my $4,000 of savings, and it's a pretty big decision since it's all my money, and I convert it to Polish currency, the zloty. I take it down to the post office, and I subscribe for these shares. And I get my $4,000 worth of shares, and over the next 12 months, my investment went up 10 times. 10 times, 1,000% in a year. And I don't know how many of you have had an investment that's gone up 10 times. If you have, you know what I'm talking about. It really feels good. And you really want to repeat that experience. And so at that point, I had found my true calling in life. I was going to get involved. I wanted to be an investor in all of these privatizations in Eastern Europe, and I knew for sure that they were going to be privatizing a lot more stuff. It was, it was clear that was just the first of many.